And coronavirus is one of the other ways that I showed my students how to stay relevant. We learned about coronavirus at the end of January, and I typically pick things from the current event so that students will have something to discuss with someone from the target culture or someone in their community or maybe someone in their own family. So the students read about coronavirus and then students did different kinds of activities. So one group, for example, summarized the article, chose vocabulary words, and then chose a picture so that they would be able to discuss coronavirus when we would have a discussion about it. Another group prepared public service announcements where they could talk about, again, the symptoms. They could use the vocabulary, but they could also give recommendations. How relevant, how timely. We had no idea how timely at that point. As we moved on, the students were dismissed to their classrooms, meaning their homes, and we created memes that they found from different parts of the world where they were discussing coronavirus and jokes. So they could relate to that. Prior to the being, I guess, dismissed for coronavirus, the students watched the Super Bowl and we talked about, for example, the Champeta Challenge because everyone had watched the Super Bowl and everyone had watched J-Lo and Shakira. And then we talked about what were some of the products they saw, what were the practices, what were the perspectives. Why were some people outraged at the Super Bowl show? Why were some people thrilled at the Super Bowl show? And some of that was based on perspective. So we talked about the roots and the history of that. Again, keeping it relevant to the students, keeping it open. So you need to be open. Being open means that your students might present an idea to you that might not be exactly the way you were thinking about it. As long as you've set your goals and your students have set your goals, how you go about doing it might need to be a little different. So let your students set their target. What is it that you need them to be able to do? I needed, for example, in my level 2 class, I needed for them to be able to introduce and describe themselves. I needed them to be able to talk about what they liked, learned, and what they did. And that's how we ended up working with Chokeep Town because they were able to say, I like this or I don't like this, but they had more games. So this was my new student in the spring, decided that the learning targets were the following: to learn how to run an agility course, to run through a tunnel, run through weave poles, and to jump a hurdle. So after 3 weeks of consistent practice, student completed the goal. And that was exciting for both the teacher and the student. And that's what you want. You always want to be relevant and you always want to be somewhat exciting. I mean, not always exciting, but engaging and exciting. So what's next? We said being open, but you also might have to be flexible. You may have to change the platforms you use. You may have to go back to a certain platform. So I know that my students expect to talk about current events. I kind of have a reputation now. So we have discussions on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, and the students realize that the work that we do leading up to that is very, very important to make them successful when they're having the discussions. So when we have a chance to practice, be it vocabulary practice, be it one-on-one pair share, that allows them, they know that there's an absolute end. They know that this will be applied in a very efficient manner, or sometimes not so efficient, depending, but it will give them, they have a reason to practice. So 60 seconds, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, they're very focused. So being open, as I said, means you may have to move platforms. You might most certainly have to move platforms. So what works with blended, hybrid, traditional, or vice versa? You may go forward, you may go backwards. So I use a number of tools traditionally in my classroom, and I always want to make sure that my students know how to use these platforms before I send them to do something at home, for example. So again, if you have the opportunity to start with a traditional classroom, then maybe you want to use a couple of tools at the beginning so that the students are anchored, and then maybe you could work some more in. So I used the following: VoiceThread. Nearpod was one we were beginning to use. We began to use more during COVID. Padlet, as you saw when we did the memes, where the students put up the memes. But we also have sort of discussion boards where students can just put a comment up. So they were accustomed to doing that. Flipgrid we were using, and then Edpuzzle. So these were all different ways that students could have an opportunity to discuss. And you can keep your class lively and relevant in the time. So the students use VoiceThread, which was an oral discussion thread. It's been around for a while, and they talked about beauty, definitions of beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, etc. So sometimes the students would have to share a picture and then discuss, and then the students would comment on whether or not they liked the picture or they didn't like the picture, depending on the level of language. I like the picture because blah blah blah, or up to my AP class where they really discussed more things. The Nearpod, in your opinion, who is the Chilean, the most important Chilean? The students would have a traditional project. We ended the year with a traditional project with famous Chileans, but we ended up having to move it to the Nearpod, where the students discussed who they thought was the most influential. We went on, and the students talked about Flipgrid. We used Flipgrid, I'm sorry, and we used Flipgrid to discuss what they had learned about Patagonia. So you have to keep your class relevant. You can keep them on track, but relevancy